Chapter 12 Homestead at Fort Ellis. After the Indian Wars of 1876 and 1877, quiet settled over the Gallatin Valley and Bozeman continued to grow. Lisha and Chat's family grew also. After Charles Ernest and Nelson Lee, three more boys were born to them: Claude, Orrin, and Guy. Little Orrin lived for 18 months only. Lisha and Chat knew their first deep sorrow when they stood at their baby's open grave. The preacher had spoken many comforting words. He told them that their child had now entered heaven and described how, even now, he played with the other little angels among the fadeless flowers. Lisha realized that in his deepest thoughts, he had rejected the doctrine of the immortal soul. Little Orrin couldn't be in heaven. He said nothing because Chat seemed to take comfort from the thought. Now occurred at an event of major importance. The railroad came to Bozeman. The Northern Pacific, which had tried to bring the railroad into the valley 10 years before and had been delayed by the opposition of the Sioux, now finished laying the rails, and the first train rolled into town in August 1883. Frederick Billings, the man for whom the city of Billings was named, and president of the Northern Pacific at the time, presided over the ceremonies. Most of the town's citizens gathered on McLeod's Hill to see the thrilling sight. Lish's little family stood close to Elliot, who watched the whole scene with great pride. Many changes had taken place since he had helped Bozeman and Buell lay out the town. Lisha and Elliot looked into each other's faces and knew a shared moment of deep satisfaction. The brothers had heard the tread of pioneers of nations yet to be. The first low wash of waves where rolls a human sea. They crossed the prairies of old, the pilgrims crossed the sea, to make the West, as they the East, the homestead of the free. Now there will be a market for the coal from Chestnut, Elliot said, and more lumber from the sawmills will go out to far places. Yes, Lisha added, and Bozeman will become an outfitting point for travelers to Yellowstone National Park. Lisha had a strong personal hope for the future, too. He thought about it as he walked home with Chat and the boys. Now that the Indians had been subdued, he hoped that the government would abandon Fort Ellis. He felt that the soldiers were no longer any help to the settlers. If they should be moved to some other place, he knew the citizens of Bozeman could manage well enough. Lisha had lived with the Indians and knew their habits and customs. His words influenced many people. They circulated a petition that Fort Ellis should be deactivated or moved. One day, Chat's sister Letty took Lisha's two older boys downtown. She met Nelson Story's daughter, a friend and schoolmate, who asked the boys' names. The older one is Charles. The younger one is Nelson Lee. Oh, is he named after my father? Yes, I'm sure he is. Well, my father will be interested to hear about his namesake. A few days later, came home and called Lee to him. Mr. Story at the bank wants to see you, Lee. What for? I suppose you've been in some mischief, Lisha teased him. Lee went to the bank with reluctance, but he found the banker all smiles and friendliness. Are you Nelson Lee Rouse? You're Nelson Lee Rouse, aren't you? Yes, sir. My name is Nelson, too. Mr. Story held out his hand, and little Lee put his small hand into the big brown one. I want you to do something for me. Will you carry this note to Mr. Wilson at the store? Lee carried the note to Wilson's general store, and after Mr. Wilson read it, he supplied Lee with a complete outfit of new clothes and sent him home, dancing with delight. Some kind ladies invited Lish's boys to attend Sunday school at the Baptist church, and they kept going until the year 1889, when something happened to change everything for the Lisha Rouse family. Fort Ellis had been deactivated. Now, after 15 years, Lisha and the other settlers who had been dispossessed when the government established the fort moved back to their claims. A beautiful creek flowed through the lands all the year round, and Lisha with Billy Lee had dug a ditch right across the place where Lisha had built his cabin. It provided water for domestic use, for stock, and for irrigation. Billy Lee also returned to his former claim in a lovely spot just south of Lisha's place. Lisha built an addition to his original log cabin and then created a comfortable home, which still stands. His children numbered 6 when the family moved to the ranch. Pearl and Helen May had been added to the 4 boys. Here on the ranch, the children enjoyed the free, active life that Lisha had always dreamed about as a deal for his family. 4 more girls were born during the early years on the ranch: Ruby, Elsie, Abby, and Sadie. Lisha and Chet delighted in their big family. The summer days were filled with work and fun, and winter brought its own kind of games and delights, as well as work and study. One day, in October 1893, Lisha took Charlie and Lee with him into the foothills to hunt deer. They came up over a ridge and surprised a lynx feeding on a dead horse. Before they could get a good shot, the lynx bounded into the bushes and vanished. A day or two later, Lee came past the place on his way to return a borrowed gun to a neighbor. He climbed the ridge to see if the lynx might still be feeding on the carcass. He would be ready for him this time. He crept up quietly and peered over the ridge. Yes, the lynx had come back to the dead horse. Lee raised his rifle and killed the animal with one shot. At the sharp report of the gun, several lynx bounded away. Lee aimed at another lynx and dropped it with a wounded shoulder. His third shot crippled another. It began crawling towards the bush, dragging its hindquarters. Lee had only 2 bullets left. He ran to head off the lynx with the wounded shoulder. With a fierce growl, it sprang at him, and he shot it through the head. Now what should he do? He had 1 bullet left, and he must pass through a woods full of lynx. Perhaps he had come on a whole family of them. He must kill the other wounded lynx too. Taking his knife from his pocket, he approached the animal, put his foot on its head, and cut its throat. Then he went on his way to deliver the borrowed rifle to the neighbors. When he related his adventure to his parents that evening, Chat looked at Lisha. Does he remind you of someone? Lisha thought back on his own adventures when he and Elliot had first come to Montana. He's beginning a little early at 14, but yes, I'd say the boy comes naturally by his love of danger. West of Lisha's farm lay the Reynolds household. Lisha observed his neighbor and thought him a strange person. He seemed to be a first-rate farmer, but he had questionable religious ideas. A preacher came to Bozeman and pitched a big tent on a vacant lot, and this man, Reynolds, helped him. An odd thing indeed. Of course, Lisha never went near the big tent, although preaching services continued for several weeks. After Lisha finished building his ranch house, he began to invite the neighbors for dances. He liked having happy people around him, and both Chat and he enjoyed dancing. The Reynolds family never came to the parties, although Lisha always invited them. They visited in the most friendly manner at other times, exchanging work and neighborly visits. One day, as Lisha started to cross the pasture to invite the Reynolds to a dance, Chat said, "Those people don't think it's right to dance, Lisha. I just found out. It's against their religion." Lisha turned back. "Well, then, we won't ask them any more. I respect any man's conscience." Fall came, and the threshing rig with its crew of farmers made the usual rounds of the wheat farms. The man who owned the rig in the Fort Ellis vicinity came by one evening, and Lisha could see that something had excited him. "I've just come from the Reynolds place," the man explained. "Went to tell Reynolds that we'd be at his place Saturday morning." He slid down from his horse, walked over to Lisha, and took hold of his shoulder. He wouldn't have it. He wouldn't have it, Lish. Lisha knew everyone in the neighborhood knew that Reynolds kept Saturday for Sunday. But anything so important as threshing, why, their winter food depended on it. The crop in the area had been heavy, and now the snow would soon fly. The man must be crazy. I suppose you can't get back to him until the other farmers are taken care of. No, and that's exactly what I told him. The man spat a wad of tobacco on the ground. Did you know that he said, you know what he said? "Even if I lose my whole crop of wheat, I will not violate God's holy Sabbath." Lisha looked over to the west where he could see the Reynolds family farm lying golden in the autumn sun, the fields covered with shocked and stacked wheat. "He's got a big crop. Best he's ever had, I think." "That's just it," the thresher said. "I never saw anyone so stubborn. Can't he think of his family? They'll suffer if the snow falls before I get back to his job." After his visitor rode away, Lisha stood thinking. None of the farmers in the valley would think of refusing to have their threshing done on Sunday if their turn came on that day. Why did Reynolds think his Sabbath so special? Lisha puzzled about the question while he went about his chores. Before the threshers could return, snow fell and more snow. The neighborhood lamented the foolishness that had caused Reynolds to leave his whole wheat crop out in the open field rather than it threshed on Saturday. Finally, late in the fall, the threshers came back to the Reynolds farm. Lisha drove one of the bobsleds that hauled the grain out of the field to the threshing machine. Amazed, he and the other neighbors saw that the wheat had suffered no damage and ran almost 50 bushels to the acre. Lisha watched the steady flow of perfect golden kernels stream from the separator's spout and felt a strange sensation. Had God protected the man's crop? After this experience, Lisha often visited his neighbor, and the talk usually ran to religion. Lisha told him of his capture by the Sioux and how God had answered his prayer for healing and deliverance. Do you think it's strange that God should answer the prayer of a sinner like me? No, Lisha, I don't think it's strange at all, Reynolds replied. God answered Jonah's prayer, even when Jonah was running away from him. Well then, tell me something. Alicia sat down on a stump and prepared for a long visit. If God answers the prayers of sinners when they're still alive, why does he burn them in hell forever and ever after they're dead? Neighbor Reynolds sat down on a wagon tongue. I don't believe the Bible teaches that God does such a thing. Lisha felt a shock of surprise. All the Christian people he knew believed in everlasting hellfire, and the better Christian they were, the more they believed it, and the more they talked about it. He felt a distinct letdown. Don't you believe there's a heaven to win and a hell to shun? Yes, I do. Reynolds leaned forward and fixed his eyes on Lisha. I believe there's a heaven to win and a hell to shun, but I don't believe that sinners are being tortured in hell now, or that they will be tortured forever and ever. Reynolds got up from the wagon tongue, came over and laid his hand on Lisha's shoulder. The results of their sins will be fixed forever and can never be changed. The duration of their punishment is another thing. God is just. He will not allow any man to suffer beyond what is just and merciful. Lisha spoke up. Doesn't the Bible say somewhere that the wicked will be punished with unquenchable fire? Reynolds stood with his hand still resting on Lisha's shoulder. He didn't say anything for a long time, and Lisha felt sure he'd stumped the man with his last question. He felt even more sure when his neighbor said, Tell you what, Lish, you should get out your Bible and find all the texts on this subject. I'll do the same. And then we'll get together and compare our findings. Sounds good to me. Lisha walked home, remembering how he had hunted out all those texts for the Bozeman preacher years before. Could he find that old list? Then he remembered that the preacher had never returned it. He'd have to make a new list. How many years had that been? Just a few weeks after he and Chat married, they had asked that preacher to Sunday dinner. Now their older children were teenagers. Lesher ran a livery stable in Bozeman, and Elliot found him one day in his little office with a Bible open before him. He had written almost a full page of notes and texts. Who do you plan to stump this time, Lish? Lisha looked up at his brother. Maybe this fellow will stump me. He's different. Lisha knew Elliot's infidel beliefs, and he chose his words with care. This fellow, my neighbor, Reynolds, doesn't believe that people have immortal souls. He doesn't believe anyone is being tormented in hell now. He doesn't believe that anyone is going to suffer in hell forever and ever. You don't say. Elliot sat down on a bench. He believes that God will deal with a man according to what has coming, will reward him according to his works.